welcome back to the channel. If you are new here, this is where we cover true horror stories from the Appalachian Mountains. Real people, real houses, real things that could not be explained. Tonight we have 5 of them for you. Before we get into it, hit subscribe, drop a like, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you are watching from tonight. We read every single one. Now let's get into the stories. I have driven I-26 westbound through the South Carolina upstate so many times that the road lives in my hands rather than my eyes. I don't navigate it the way you navigate a road you're learning. I inhabit it the way you inhabit a room you have woken up in every morning for 15 years. My foot comes off the gas before the speed limit changes because my body has memorized the relationship between the road's feel and what the sign will say when it appears. My hands manage the rolling grades of the foothills without consulting my mind about it. I had driven it for 15 years when the thing happened that I still cannot fully account for. And the 15 years matter because they set the baseline against which everything I'm about to describe should be measured. I left my mother's house in Columbia at 11:15 on a Sunday in late October. She had cooked, and the meal had run into conversation the way it always does when I visit. And there is always something in the way she pauses at the door when I'm leaving that adds another 40 minutes to the evening. I had a meeting at 8 in the morning in Asheville that I could not move. The road was dry, almost no traffic. The late October mountain air coming through the cracked window in the particular way it does when the elevation starts building in the foothills. Not cold enough to close the window, but cool enough that you want it there. Want that specific quality of air moving through the car at night when there is nothing on the road and nothing required of you except to drive the road, you know. The headlights appeared in my mirror somewhere past the Spartanburg city limits. In the stretch where the interchange lighting fades and the highway goes back to the dark, it mostly is. 2 lights behind me at what seemed like a standard following distance, 8 or 10 car lengths. A vehicle behind you on an interstate is not information. It is background. I continued at my speed, and the car behind me continued at exactly my speed, which I noticed and did not yet assign meaning to. What I noticed first, before the behavior, was the color of the lights. A white that was too even, too consistent, without the slight variation in intensity that headlights produce as they move through distance and angle. White in the way that something carefully composed to be white is white. Uniform, deliberate. I tested it the way you test things when you are not yet willing to admit you are testing anything. A slight reduction in pressure on the accelerator, enough to cost me 5 miles an hour over a quarter mile. The car behind me reduced at exactly my rate and held the same distance. I brought my speed up. It came with me. I moved to the right lane. It moved to the right lane. I moved back to the left. It came back. The rest stop appeared at mile marker 60-something. I pulled in without signaling. The car behind me did not pull in. It continued past at exactly the speed it had been traveling, without hesitation, without slowing, without any acknowledgement of my exit from the highway. I sat in the rest stop for 7 minutes and watched the clock. Used the restroom, walked once around the building in the cold air, bought water from a machine that took 3 attempts to accept my dollar. When I got back on the highway, the road behind me was empty and the road ahead was empty, and I drove for approximately 4 minutes at my normal speed before the white lights appeared in my mirror again. Same distance, same wrong evenness. The car had not been behind me, and then it was behind me. And between those 2 states, I had been on a road I know for 15 years, and I had watched both directions, and there was nothing there to become what was now there. I drove the remaining 40 minutes home without stopping. The car drove the 40 minutes behind me. When I took my exit, it did not take my exit. I watched it in the mirror as I left the highway, its lights continuing forward, not slowing, not accelerating, simply going wherever it was going, as if the 40 minutes behind me had been incidental to a journey that had its own destination. I have thought about that for 2 years, and I have found no framework that holds it without breaking. What I keep returning to is the rest stop. The thing that requires explaining is not the speed matching. which I can construct alternate theories for, however weak. The thing that requires explaining is the reappearance. I was on that road. I watched that road. Whatever had been behind me was not on the road I was watching. And then it was behind me again. And it drove the rest of the way, as though it had been there all along. The Lumber River lowlands have a quality that the rest of Robeson County does not. And I say this as someone who has driven every paved and unpaved road in that county for 11 years. I am a rural mail carrier. I have a professional relationship with rural roads that most people do not develop. Not just familiarity, but a structural understanding of how the road system fits together. To which county routes dead end at old homesteads that the Postal Service still has on record because the family stopped collecting mail 1 year and the route was closed by attrition rather than administration. I know this county from the surface of its roads in a way that cannot be acquired by driving through it. Only by delivering it, which is a different thing. The lowland stretch of US 74 runs between walls of pine and wetland vegetation tall enough to eliminate the horizon. There is no sky at night except directly overhead, a long slot above the road, and on either side of you the dense dark of the tree line that the road cuts through. It is not dramatic. It does not ask anything of you technically. But it has a quality I have never been able to name precisely, something about the enclosure of it. The way even in daylight, it feels like the road goes through something rather than past it. I was driving it at 20 minutes to 2 on a Friday night in March, coming back from a birthday gathering in Pembroke. The road empty the way it is always empty at that hour in that stretch. The trees going by on both sides in the headlights, and then going back to dark behind me. The white car was parked on the right shoulder, approximately a mile past the state road junction I use as a midpoint marker. Older sedan, boxy, domestic, from the early 90s before aerodynamics changed the shapes. Parked completely off the road, both right wheels on the gravel shoulder, positioned precisely parallel to the road the way someone parks who is comfortable doing it and has done it before. No lights, no hazard flashers, no visible occupant through the rear windshield as I passed. I noted it and drove on and thought about it the way you think about things that don't quite resolve. A car parked on a highway shoulder at 2 in the morning in the Lumber River lowlands is not common. It is not impossible. I ran through the reasonable explanations and found they all fit the visible evidence, and I let it go. The white car was parked on the right shoulder at the point where 74 crosses the first of the 2 Lumber River bridges, 6 miles from where I had passed it the first time. I know the distance because I know every mile of that route. And I know the bridge junction specifically because it is a landmark I use when I calculate time remaining. 6 miles. Same model, as far as I could determine. Same parking position, both right wheels on gravel, parallel, and the same offset from the road edge. No lights, no occupant visible, no exhaust vapor in the cold air. The road between those 2 points is direct. There is no parallel route. I had been on that highway for the entire 6 miles, and I had passed 1 car going east and nothing going west. I had not passed a white sedan being driven at any speed between those points. Whatever was at the bridge had not been driven there while I was behind it. I pulled over at a logging access and sat with the engine running and tried to find the piece of the sequence I had wrong. I sat for 4 minutes and found nothing. Each reasonable explanation tried and found to require something the evidence does not support. I pulled back onto the highway and drove the remaining 11 miles without looking in the mirrors more than was necessary for safety. I had decided there were things I was better off not confirming. The white car was either going to be there or not, and neither answer was one I wanted to have. What I have not been able to account for in the years since is the parking position. Both times, both right wheels on the shoulder, parallel, the same offset from the road edge. Not approximate. I am someone who notices things and records them precisely. The parking position was identical in a way that felt considered. Like whatever had been at the first point had thought about how it was parked when it moved to the second. Like the care taken to reproduce the position was itself a message in a language I did not have the vocabulary to read. there is a specific kind of knowledge that accumulates over 8 years of driving the same mountain road. And US 129 north from Cleveland through the Georgia Gorge country is a road I have driven for 8 years since my wife's family moved to a property outside of Hiawassee, and the route became my regular way north. The road follows the gorge terrain the way 2 lanes in that part of the range follow gorge terrain, which is to say it submits to the landscape rather than imposing on it. It goes where the rock and water allow. It narrows where the gorge walls close in. It crosses the Tallulah drainage twice and smaller tributaries half a dozen more times on bridges that in some cases have been there since the 30s. I know the bridge that vibrates at a specific frequency when you cross it above 40 miles an hour. I know the grade of the final climb before the road levels at the county line. I know what the air smells like through an open window in late September in the deep gorge section, which is the cold water smell of the river and the specific composition of mountain air at that elevation at that hour, which is a thing that cannot be described adequately and that the body recognizes immediately and completely. I want to say something about the radio on that road before I tell you what happened on it. The behavior of radio signals in the gorge section is something I have understood for years as a practical matter. Cell signal goes first, somewhere between the first bridge crossing and the second, in a gap so consistent, I use it as a landmark. Radio follows shortly after, degrading from reliable to intermittent to barely functional as the gorge walls rise. By the deepest section, the only signals that come through clearly are the strongest local transmitters, and even those are subject to dropout. I have driven that section in silence many times, the radio cutting to static and me reaching for it and then leaving it, because the silence of the gorge on a night drive is its own kind of company. And after enough years, I have learned not to fight it. I left Cleveland at 11:45 on a Thursday night in late September. My wife and I had been through 3 years of difficulty before our daughter arrived 14 months ago. 3 years of grief of a specific kind. The kind that arrives in the form of hope, that then fails repeatedly in the way that medical hope fails when it is attached to something your body is doing or not doing that you cannot control. I mention this only because it explains what was running underneath the drive that night, the processing you do in cars on familiar roads late at night when no one needs you to be anything other than awake and moving through the dark. The radio was carrying a country station out of Blairsville through the first section of the gorge, holding steadily enough that I left it. Then, in the deep section, past the second bridge crossing, it did something I had not seen it do in 8 years of driving that route. It did not degrade to static. It changed. The Blairsville station simply became something else, in the clean, silent way that one image becomes another when you stop looking at it and look back. What replaced it was a voice, a woman's voice. I'm speaking in the conversational register of someone telling a story to someone who already knows most of it. The audio quality was not a program quality. It was personal, recorded in a room, a space with ambient presence. She was talking about this road, not a road or driving in general. This road. She described the second bridge crossing with a specificity that stopped my breathing. She described the particular vibration frequency of that bridge, the way the river sound comes up through the floor of the car on the metal decking. She described the curve after the bridge, the darkness of the gorge wall on the right, and the way the guardrail catches the headlights and disappears into the curve, and you have to trust it rather than follow it. She described the exact quality of the air through an open window in that section. Just she knew the sound. She knew how it felt in the car body. She knew what the air smelled like. She described it the way someone describes something they have experienced, not heard about. My wife's name is the thing I have not said and will not say. But I will tell you that the voice on that radio in the gorge section of US 129 at midnight in late September knew that road the way she knows it. The way anyone knows a road they have driven many times with someone they love, as a passenger, which gives you a different kind of knowledge than driving gives you. The road as it accumulates in the body of someone who has experienced it from the seat beside the driver and has their own particular relationship with its sound and smell, and the specific quality of the cold mountain air through the cracked window. She was home with the baby that night. I know this because I spoke to her after I arrived, found her awake in the kitchen with tea and the particular alert tiredness of a person who has been managing an infant alone and has not quite settled when the infant finally slept. She was in a kitchen in Hiawassee, and the voice on the radio was in the gorge. And these things are not compatible with any framework I know how to use. Then the signal died, with the clean absence of something removed, not static, just gone. And I drove the rest of the way with the radio off and the window still cracked and the cold water smell of the gorge still in the car. I know the roads of Bertie County, North Carolina, the way a person knows roads they have driven since they were old enough to drive. Which is to say, not consciously, but physically. Costs in the hands and the foot and the body's anticipation of what the road will do before it does it. I grew up on a farm on the county's western edge, and I learned those roads in the dark in my father's pickup, the way young people learn roads in rural counties, by driving them at hours when they shouldn't be out and in conditions that required more attention than they had at the time. I have 40 years of those roads in me. The particular flatness of the eastern Carolina terrain, the way the ditches run alongside the road and the fields press in from both sides, and the horizons are enormous even at night. Even in the dark, when you cannot see them, you can feel the openness of the land. The way sound travels differently in flat open country than it does in the hills. I know what it feels like to be in that landscape at 3 in the morning. I know what belongs in it at that hour and what does not. I was heading back from a job site in Windsor on a Tuesday night in early April. A route that took me down secondary roads rather than the highway, because the highway adds 20 minutes in that part of the county, and I know the back roads well enough not to need the highway's guidance. It was late, closer to midnight than I'd planned, and the fields were showing the beginning of spring growth in my headlights, the low green that comes up in eastern Carolina in April when the ground finally decides to cooperate. No other vehicles for the past 40 minutes. The roads out there at that hour give you the honest condition of empty, not the pretend empty of a road that might have something around the next curve, but the genuine empty of a road that hasn't had anyone on it in a long time, and won't for a long time after. The figure was standing at the edge of the ditch on the right side of the road, at a point where the road runs perfectly straight for nearly a mile, and my headlights had been showing me empty road for the full length of that straightaway for what felt like 2 minutes before he appeared. This is the thing I have come back to every time I've tried to make sense of it. The straightaway is long enough that I should have seen him before I saw him. A person standing at the road edge in headlights is visible at a significant distance on a flat, straight road in dark country. I should have had time to recognize the shape, reduce my speed, make sense of what I was seeing. Instead, he was simply there when my lights found him, at a distance that should already have had him in frame, as though he had stepped into the edge of visibility from somewhere that visibility does not reach. He was an old man. I could see that as I passed. Old in the way that rural old is a different thing from other old, not diminished, but reduced to what is essential. White hair, dark clothing, standing completely still with his back straight and his hands at his sides and his face turned toward the road. Not toward my headlights, the way a person turns toward approaching lights. Toward the road. Toward the surface of it, as if it were something he was reading. I watched him in my mirror for as long as he stayed visible, and he did not move. He was still there when my mirror lost him to distance, standing in the same position, his face turned down toward the road he was standing beside. I turned around at the next intersection. I want to be honest about the time this took. The intersection was perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, which meant I drove a quarter-mile, turned, and drove back. At the speed I was traveling, that is approximately 90 seconds. I drove back slowly with my windows down and my lights on high beam, and there was nothing at the road edge where he had been. The ditch was empty. The field behind the ditch showed nothing. The road in both directions showed nothing. In 90 seconds, in flat open country where the fields are visible for long distances, a man who had been standing at a road edge had gone somewhere that flat open country does not offer easily, which is to say he had gone somewhere that should have been visible and was not. I still drive those roads. I have to. They go where I need to go. and 40 years of road knowledge does not yield to a single night. But I drive the long straightaways differently now. I watch the full length of them before I enter. And if the length shows me empty road, and then at some point in that emptiness, a shape appears that should have been visible from farther away, I do not slow down. I do not stop. I drive through whatever is standing at the road edge, and I do not look in the mirror until I have put enough distance between myself and that point on the road to make looking back a thing I can manage without it mattering. I want to describe the way a West Texas highway behaves at 4 in the morning before I describe what I saw on 1, because people who haven't driven that country at that hour do not have an accurate picture of what it is. US 385 south of Fort Stockton runs through terrain so open and so flat that the horizon exists in every direction simultaneously, which sounds like a comfort and is not, because a horizon you can see at night is a horizon that offers you nothing. Just the long flat dark of the Chihuahuan Desert going out to the edge of what your eyes can reach, and then continuing in the same condition past that edge without changing. The stars in that country at 4 in the morning are not a comfort either. They are too many and too close, and they make the sky feel like a ceiling that has been lowered rather than a vastness that has been opened. I have driven that highway many times for work. The oil patch country between Pecos and Fort Stockton and the long empty stretches south. And I have developed the particular relationship with that road that you develop with any road you drive, often in the dark, which is a relationship of familiarity that does not become comfort, that stays in the register of something known but not mastered. I had left Fort Stockton at 3:30 in the morning, an early start necessitated by a site meeting that could not be moved. The road south was empty in the way that road is always empty before dawn, completely and in all directions, nothing moving on it or near it for as far as the flat terrain allowed me to see. I had been driving for about 40 minutes when I saw the lights ahead of me, which in that country at that hour is an event. Not headlights coming toward me from the south, but lights off to the right of the highway in the desert, perhaps a quarter mile off the road. Stationary lights, several of them. The amber and white of work lighting, the kind of array you see on a job site when work is happening at night. I noted them and drove on. Oil country has night work, generators, pump jacks, maintenance crews. The desert at 4 in the morning is not empty of industry, even when it is empty of everything else. What made me note it again, and then keep noting it, was the interval. I watched the cluster of lights in my peripheral vision as I drove south, and the cluster did not recede the way objects do when you are moving away from them at highway speed. It kept pace. The same quarter-mile offset, the same angular position relative to my vehicle. I drove another mile watching it, and it stayed at exactly that distance and angle, which is a thing that requires movement, which is a thing that requires whatever was producing those lights to be moving south at exactly my speed. A quarter mile to the right, through open desert, over terrain that has no road in it. I slowed. The lights slowed. I brought my speed back up, and the lights came with me. I stopped on the highway's shoulder and got out of the truck in the cold desert night and stood in the dark, looking east. The lights were there, a quarter mile off. Stationary now, the amber and white of work lighting burning steadily in the flat, dark desert. Not moving, not approaching, not receding. Just there, present at that distance in the way of something that intended to be at that distance. I stood on the shoulder for 3 minutes in the wind that comes off the desert at 4 in the morning in West Texas, which is a wind that has been moving over a very large empty space for a very long time and carries the temperature of that space into whatever it finds in its way. And then I got back in the truck because standing in the dark next to a highway, looking at lights in the desert that had been matching my speed, was a thing I had exhausted my capacity to do. I drove the remaining distance without stopping. The lights did not reappear. I have looked at maps of that section of desert east of 385, and there is nothing there. No road, no facility, no infrastructure of any kind that would produce work lighting a quarter mile off the highway. I have asked people who work the oil patch in that area if there are sites that far off the road, and they have said no, that the terrain doesn't warrant it. and that the geology in that section doesn't produce the kind of formation that brings a rig that far from a road. What was in the desert south of Fort Stockton at 4 in the morning, keeping pace with my truck in flat open country with no road in it, I cannot tell you. I can tell you the lights were real. My eyes were working. The desert was showing me something that was there. Something that moved when I moved, and stopped when I stopped, and waited at exactly the distance it preferred, and did not come closer and did not go away until I chose to leave it behind. I have been a nurse for 16 years, which means I drive to and from work at hours that most people associate with being in bed. And I have developed over those 16 years the particular night driving habits of someone for whom the dark hours are just hours, not a different category of time that requires different caution or carries different weight. I am not someone who frightens easily on roads. I am not someone who permits the dark to do things to my perception that the daylight would not. I drive the same roads at 3 in the morning that I drive at 3 in the afternoon, and I expect them to behave the same way, because in 16 years of night driving, they have, with one exception that I am going to describe now as accurately as I am able. State Road 46 through the Indiana Hill Country is my commute home from the hospital in Bedford, a 2-lane that runs through the Mitchell Plain karst country, the territory of the sinkholes and the cave systems that underlie that part of southern Indiana, and that give the terrain a quality I have always found hard to articulate. The land looks normal from the surface, rolling, forested, the road moving through it in the way roads move through forested hill country anywhere. But the geology underneath it is hollow in ways the surface does not reveal, full of voids and passages and underground water that has been carving through the limestone for thousands of years. And I have always thought that this hollowness under a normal-looking surface gives the terrain a quality that the terrain of places built on solid ground does not have. A quality of depth that goes in the wrong direction, not up toward the sky, but down into the dark below the road. I was driving home from a night shift on a Thursday in late November, a shift that had been difficult in the specific way that hospital shifts are sometimes difficult, not dramatically, but cumulatively, on the kind of night where nothing resolves cleanly, and you carry the weight of it into the car and onto the road and drive home with it sitting behind your eyes. It was 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. The road was empty. I had been on it for about 15 minutes and was approaching a stretch I know specifically because of a particular tree on the right side of the road. A large oak that split into 2 main trunks about 8 feet up in a way that always looks in headlights like a figure with arms raised, and which I have registered every time I've passed it for years as my marker for the halfway point of the commute. The tree was not there. I want to be precise about this, because the absence of a large tree you have registered hundreds of times is not a subtle thing. The tree was not there. The right side of the road, where the oak has stood for as long as I've driven this road, was tree line, ordinary tree line. No gap where the oak stands, no stump, no remnant of a tree that had been removed. The tree line was continuous and unbroken, and I drove past the point where the oak should have been, and there was nothing at that point except the forest continuing the way it continues on either side of where the oak stands when the oak is there. I checked the odometer. I was at the right mileage for the oak's location. I drove another 1.5 miles to the next landmark I use, a small church with a lit sign on the left. And the church was there, the sign was lit, the mileage was correct. The oak was the right distance from my starting point and the right distance from the church. The oak was in the right place. The oak was not there. I drove the rest of the way home with the particular quality of attention that comes when the familiar has failed to be familiar. When a thing that was supposed to be there was not there in a way that the distance and the mileage and every other reference point confirmed should not be possible. In the morning, I drove the road in daylight and the oak was there. Both trunks, the fork at 8 feet, the way it looks like a figure with arms raised. There, completely there, showing no evidence of having been absent. I drove past it slowly and looked at it. And it looked back the way a large old tree looks back, which is without acknowledgement, without any indication that something had happened to it in the night that warranted looking at it closely in the morning. I have not found a version of that night that makes the oak's absence explainable. I have settled for the version where some roads at some hours show you something about the ground they run through that the ground would prefer you not see. And I have settled for paying less attention to the right side of that road at the halfway point of my commute. And I have settled for being grateful that whatever was true about the road on that particular night in November was not true in the morning when I needed the road to be what I knew it to be. Some adjustments you make without examining them too closely. You make them and you drive on. My grandmother's people came from the mountains of eastern Tennessee, from the plateau country above Crossville, where the forested ridges run east to west in long parallel formations, and the hollows between them have a quality of enclosure that is different from the mountains to the east. Not dramatic, not steep, but specific. The way the terrain contains sound and holds darkness and keeps weather in the low ground between the ridges longer than the surrounding country. She used to describe that terrain the way some people describe a language they grew up speaking and can no longer find anyone to speak with a mixture of fluency and mourning. She described the roads through those ridges with the specificity of someone for whom that geography was as present as the road outside her window, even decades after she had last driven it. She told me once that the old roads had their own logic, that they followed the land rather than imposing on it, and that this was why they did not survive into the modern map, because they were too specific to their ground, too embedded in a particular understanding of a particular landscape to be abstracted into the notation that state route systems require. I thought about her saying this on a Tuesday night in September when I was driving back toward Crossville from a job site and took, or believed I had taken, the county road I always take through the ridge south of the highway. I know this road. I have driven it for 6 years since I moved to that part of the plateau for work. I know it in the body the way you know any road you have driven enough times, in enough conditions. The switchback near the bottom, the long ascending straight, the two curves close together near the midpoint where the road crosses a small creek. I was on the upper portion, past the creek, approaching the final left-hand bend that I know precedes the ridgetop. The bend I have taken perhaps 200 times. I came around it, and it was not the bend I knew. The curve that appeared in my headlights was sharper than the curve I know. A hard left with its own advisory signage I had never seen before. The reflective markers arranged at the spacing you use for tighter curves, and the road surface through this curve showing the wear patterns of long use. The tire tracks on the asphalt were not fresh. They were the kind of marks that accumulate over years, the path worn into the surface the way water wears a channel. When this road had been driven many times by many vehicles over a period of time that left marks in the pavement. I followed the curve because I was in it, and my only options were to take it or stop. And stopping on a mountain curve at night with no shoulder is its own category of danger. My hands did what hands do in a curve. My foot managed the speed. I drove through a curve that should not have existed, that I had never driven before, that nevertheless had the infrastructure and the wear of a road that had been there for a long time. The curve descended. The road I know stays level through that final bend before descending on the far side. This curve took me down the eastern face of the ridge, on a line I did not recognize, through switchbacks I had never taken, and past 2 places where the road crossed drainage channels on small concrete bridges I had never seen. The trees on either side were old growth, heavy trunks close to the road edge. No evidence of the clearing and secondary growth you see alongside roads that have been maintained and improved in recent decades. The road felt old, not deteriorated, functional, drivable, just old in the way of something built a long time ago and maintained without being changed. I drove approximately 12 minutes of descent, which is 3 times longer than the descent on the road I know. 12 minutes covers significant distance. The ridge I was crossing is not wide enough to provide 12 minutes of descent at the speed I was traveling. The math does not work for the ridge I have crossed 50 times. When it works for a different ridge or a different route across the same ridge, neither of which the map shows. I came out on the valley floor at a junction I recognized 2 miles south of where I should have emerged. The road I had descended ended at this junction in a way that the junction itself did not seem to expect. No stop sign treating it as an approaching road, no road markings. As if from the junction's perspective, the road I had just driven did not exist. I sat at that junction long enough to be cold. And then I drove home on roads I knew, and I did not go back until morning. And in the morning, I drove the road from the valley upward, and found the old bridges and the heavy timber, and drove until I reached what I believed was the ridgetop, and found the road continuing to join the county road I have driven 50 times. Joining it at a point where the county road shows no evidence of an intersection, no worn approach, no cleared sight lines, nothing. The county road at that point has no acknowledgement on its surface that anything has ever met it there. I have looked at historical topographic maps, and the road appears on some of the older materials with a designation I cannot trace to any current administrative record. It does not appear on any map made after 1971. Whatever happened to it between then and now, whether it was closed or abandoned or simply ceased to be administered, I cannot determine. What I know is that I drove it, and it knew the way through the mountain, and it brought me where I needed to go by a route that should not have been available to me. I want to start by telling you what the rest area in the Powell Valley corridor of northeastern Tennessee is like at 2 in the morning, because the geography matters and because the context matters in ways that are inseparable from what I found there. The valley runs southwest to northeast through a long trough between Clinch Mountain to the north and Powell Mountain to the south, and the interstate that follows it has a quality of enclosure that is specific to that corridor. The ridges on both sides blocking the horizon, the road running through the valley floor with the mountains as walls. The darkness between the highway and the ridgeline complete and lightless, in a way that highway corridor lighting makes worse rather than better, by providing reference points that make the dark on either side of them more absolute by contrast. I had been on a job site outside of Bristol since 6:30 in the morning. By the time I got to my truck and started the drive home, it was after 9 in the evening. And there was construction on 81 south of Kingsport that compressed traffic to a single lane for 4 miles and cost me 45 minutes I did not have. What I want you to understand is the number: 18 hours. Sunrise to past 2 in the morning, behind the wheel or on a job site. A fast food lunch eaten in the truck between tasks, and nothing since. The particular fatigue of that duration is not the drowsy fatigue of someone who needs sleep. It is a deeper thing. A hollowness that runs through the whole body. A state where everything requires slightly more effort than it should. I was functional. I had made that assessment honestly. Egas the way I make assessments about conditions and what they require. But I was tired enough that the rest area appeared on the right, like a reprieve I had not been expecting, and took without deliberating. I parked under the working overhead light in the center of the lot, specifically under it, because 19 years of job site work has made me habitual about being parked where I can see my vehicle. I noted that 2 other lights in my section were out. I went inside, used the restroom, ran cold water over my wrists and the back of my neck the way I do on long drives, looked at myself in the mirror with the particular neutrality of someone too tired for self-assessment who is simply verifying the face is still there, bought crackers from the vending machine, and ate them standing in the covered walkway because sitting down felt like the beginning of a decision I could not afford to make. 12 minutes at the outside. I have reconstructed the sequence carefully, and I cannot find more than 15 minutes in it. I walked back to my truck and unlocked it from 20 feet out. Watched the lights flash when I pressed the button, got in, closed the door, started the engine, and did what I always do before pulling out of any parking space. I checked my mirrors. Left mirror, right mirror, rear view. The indentation was in the center of the rear bench seat. I want to be precise about this, because the precision is what has stayed with me across the years since. It was not a subtle thing, not the kind of almost impression you second guess, but it was the clear, distinct compression that upholstery takes on when weight has been applied to it. The center cushion pushed down, the fabric not yet returned to its resting position. The shape of it was not ambiguous. It was the shape that a person's weight makes when a person sits in the center of a bench seat. I put my hand on the seat. I felt warmth, not the ambient warmth of a truck interior parked in a mild evening. It had not been a mild evening. It had been 40-some degrees in that valley, and my truck had been sitting without the engine for 15 minutes with the windows up, and the interior would have been approaching ambient temperature. This was the warmth that upholstery retains from a body, the specific retained heat of a surface that has had a warm human being in contact with it recently enough that the cooling process was not complete. The seat was warm in the center where the impression was. The seat on either side of the impression was cooler by a degree I could feel with my palm. I sat with my hand on the back seat and looked at the parking lot through my windshield and my windows, and what I saw was empty. The two semis at the far end unchanged. No one moving near my truck or between my truck and the restroom building. My windows had not been opened. My door had been locked when I unlocked it from 20 feet away. I got out and walked the perimeter of the truck. All four doors showed no sign of having been forced. No scratches around the lock mechanisms, no damage to the door frames. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping, every interior light on, flooding the cab with light, eliminating the shadows behind me as completely as I could manage. The back seat was empty every time I checked it. The warmth had faded by the time I reached the highway, had gone to the ambient temperature of the truck interior, and left nothing behind except the impression in the upholstery, which I watched in the mirror for the rest of the drive, gradually returning to its resting shape. By the time I pulled into my own driveway, it had returned completely. The bench seat looked like no one had ever sat in it, like whatever weight had been there had never existed. I did not imagine the warmth. After 19 years of assessing conditions and making judgments about what is real and what requires attention, I know the difference between what I felt and what I might have constructed from fatigue. The warmth was there. My hand remembers it. Some things you do not stop remembering, no matter how much returning to them costs you. My father died 11 years ago in February in a hospital in Harlan, Kentucky, with my mother and my sister and me in the room, and the mountains outside the window doing what the mountains do in February, holding the cold and the gray and the particular indifference to human events that makes the Appalachian terrain feel ancient in a way that is sometimes comforting and sometimes the opposite. He was 63. He had worked the mines for 20 years and then a series of other jobs after the mines changed, and the work had done what that kind of work does over time. And the last few years had been a diminishment that I will not describe in detail, because some things deserve to stay private, even in an account that requires honesty. I have spent 11 years learning to carry that, the way you learn to carry any permanent weight. Not by making it lighter, but by strengthening around it. I know his voice. I need you to understand this before anything else. I know it the way you know a voice you have heard your entire life, from infancy to adulthood. Across every register, a voice moves through. The working voice, the tired voice, the rare occasion of laughter, the voice in the car on long drives through these same mountains when I was a child, and he was driving and the radio was on. And he would sometimes talk about what we were passing through, about the land and the history of it, about the families that had lived in certain hollows and what had become of them. I have voicemails on an old phone I have not been able to upgrade because the voicemails are on it. I have a video from a Christmas 4 years before he died, where he talks for several minutes about something I no longer remember the content of, because now, when I watch it, I am only listening to the voice. I know his voice. That is not a claim I make carelessly. I was on US 23 southbound through eastern Kentucky at 1:30 in the morning, 11 days after my aunt's funeral. She was the last of his immediate family, and her passing had closed something in a way I was still working through. Not just her loss, but the particular finality of the last person who had known him as a brother, and who carried memories of him I had access to through her, and that now had nowhere left to live. The radio had been on a station out of Pikeville for the past hour. Old country, Haggard and Jones. The music that was on in his kitchen on Saturday mornings and in his truck on long drives. The music that gives me access to the atmosphere of my childhood more reliably than almost anything else. I had left it on because it was company of the right kind, present without being demanding, providing a thin barrier between me and the accumulated weight of the drive and the dark and the mountains and the 2 weeks just passed. The station changed at 23 minutes past 2. not to static and then to something else. It shifted cleanly without interruption, the way a station shifts when a transmitter changes programming. The old country song ended mid-note. What followed was a talk program. A man's voice. The quality of audio that call-in radio has, slightly compressed, slightly thin. The way voices sound through a medium-quality telephone connection broadcast over FM. I registered the change and let it be. Radio stations in the mountains at night behave strangely, picking up signals from distances the daytime signal shouldn't reach. Programs bleeding through from frequencies that aren't yours. I have driven these mountains at night for 30 years, and I know that the radio after midnight is not reliable. So I let it be, and I listened to the voice. He was talking about US 23. He said the number, then described a stretch of it I could place, a section I had driven perhaps 40 minutes earlier, describing the specific curve where the ridge comes close to the road on the right side and the place where the creek runs under the road, in a culvert you can hear when the windows are down. He described these things with the specificity of someone who has driven that road many times, who knows it the way you know a road you have returned to repeatedly over the course of your life. And his voice was my father's voice. I want to be careful here because I have been careful with this for 2 years. I cannot tell you with certainty that the voice on that radio was my father's voice. I can tell you it was close enough. The pitch of it, the particular quality of the Eastern Kentucky accent that my father had, the way certain words were shaped, the cadence, the rhythm of how he built a sentence. My body responded before my mind had time to apply skepticism. My hands went tight on the wheel and then began to shake, with the fine tremor that the body produces when the nervous system receives something it cannot categorize. When the emotional response fires before the rational assessment can intervene. He was talking about the mountains at night, about driving through them when you're tired and the road asks something of you that your body isn't sure it is left to give. About the way the dark between the ridges has a quality that daylight doesn't prepare you for. A depth and a texture that requires a different kind of attention. He talked about this the way my father talked about things he knew well, not with the performed authority of someone demonstrating knowledge, but with the easy, specific fluency of someone for whom the knowledge is simply part of how they see the world. He said something about the hollows holding things that the road passes through without understanding. And he said it in a way that was so entirely the way my father would have said it that I had to press my hand to my mouth to contain whatever was trying to come out of it. I pulled over on the shoulder, not a planned stop. The shoulder appeared on the right, and I took it and put the car in park and sat with the engine running and the radio on and listened. I sat on the shoulder of US 23 in Eastern Kentucky at 2:30 in the morning with my hand over my mouth and tears on my face that I was not aware of until they were there. I changed the station after 2 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when I finally reached for the dial. The frequency I had been on was static, flat, undifferentiated static. Not a station that had recently changed programming, but the static of a frequency that carries nothing, that indicates nothing about having ever carried anything. I went back to it 3 times. Static only. I have looked for the program. I have looked for any call-in show or talk radio format that runs on any station that broadcasts into that part of Eastern Kentucky at that hour. I have not found anything that fits. I have listened to recordings trying to find the voice, trying to find a host who sounds like what I remember, the specific combination of accent and cadence and word choice that my body recognized on that shoulder. I have not found it. My father drove US 23 his whole life. He knew those mountains the way he knew his own hands. Whatever spoke in his voice about roads and dark and the specific quality of driving through mountains at an hour when the darkness has weight, it knew those roads the way he knew them. It described them the way he would have described them. Whether that means anything, whether it resolves into anything I can hold and examine and draw conclusions from, I cannot say. I have carried it for 2 years. I have found that some things do not resolve. They simply remain present, specific, unanswered. I still drive US 23 through the mountains. I still drive it at night because the road goes where I need to go, but I leave the radio off now on that stretch. What in the section where the ridge comes close on the right and the creek runs under in a culvert, you can hear with the windows down. I drive it in silence. and I think about my father, and I do not reach for the dial. I am not sure I could bear to find it again. I am not sure, if I am honest, that I could bear not to.